Welcome to the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Jamieson, and I'm your host. Stay tuned as we dive into this week's episode. Pastoral ministry is often measured by the wrong metrics: attendance numbers, program growth, visible results, and the constant pressure to deliver. But what if the work of a pastor is better understood not as managing outcomes, but as tending a garden? My guest today is Matthew Erickson, pastor of Eastbrook Church in Milwaukee and author of the new book, Pastor as Gardener. Drawing deeply from Scripture, the Christian tradition, and voices like Eugene Peterson and Wendell, Matt invites us to imagine pastoral ministry through the patient, earthy, hopeful work of gardening. Gardeners don't manufacture growth. They cultivate conditions for life. They kneel in the soil, they wait, they tend, and they trust that God brings the growth. In this conversation, we explore what it means for pastors and the churches who call them to rediscover ministry as a slow, hopeful, deeply rooted vocation. Matt, welcome to Faith Informing.
Thank you so much, Travis. It's a huge privilege to join you. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. It's always great to be able to talk to another pastor. Often we have authors and professors, different theologians on this show, and it's just great to have a conversation with a fellow pastor. So really, thank you for being here.
It's a joy. Yeah, I'm grateful for this conversation, and thanks for all that you're doing as a faithful pastor where you are in California.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just dive into the book. And through this first question, I want to talk about the book, of course, but also hear a bit more about your story. And the first question is just about the origin of the metaphor. You write a whole book about the metaphor of the gardener and using that for pastoral ministry. And it's obviously such a rich image. But where did this metaphor begin for you personally? And when did you realize it could reshape how we understand pastoral ministry?
Well, I have a deep connection with gardening as an activity. In fact, just this last weekend, my wife Kelly and I were adding to our raised bed gardens around our yard in Milwaukee. And it's just part of what we've done with our family as our kids have grown up. There's something powerful about teaching kids how to connect with the soil and grow things and savor the fruits of their labors. So we've done that. Our kids are grown now, but we still garden a lot ourselves. But that kind of goes deep in my own story. I grew up in the Midwest, which is, an agricultural area, largely speaking. I grew up in the Mississippi River Valley of Illinois and just had a lot of roots in my family. We were not farmers, but connected in and around that. And my dad and his parents and my great-grandparents were tenant farmers in central Illinois. And then my dad kind of carried that through his parents with gardening in the yard and even in plots that we would rent. So I think that was just like part of the atmosphere of the environment I grew up in, doing these things, enjoying the food that we would grow. But then I think I started to realize as I went on a journey of trying to kind of find my footing again after some destabilizing and confusing times, just revisiting parts of Scripture, and I just found that some of the metaphors, the agrarian imagery of Scripture just started coming alive in my imagination and helped me find a doorway back into what I believe is a fruitful pathway forward for pastoral ministry for me. And but it's connected to my own lived experience as a gardener very much.
Mm. What is it like to be a gardener when you live in an urban area like Milwaukee? Obviously, there's tons of farmland within Wisconsin, but Milwaukee's a dense city. What about the gardening metaphor works there, do you think?
Yeah, I'll use an example from a ministry here at Eastbrook, which is our food pantry. Our food pantry recently transitioned from a sort of typical model of handing out bags of food to people in our zip code to what we call a choice model, where people come in and they can, choose the food that they want from within certain different types of categories. That's been revolutionary for just, I think, giving dignity to those who are coming in to our food pantry already sometimes feeling lacking dignity. And then alongside of that, over the last several years, our food pantry team has also created a garden as part of that ministry, where volunteers from within the church and some of them within the ministry of the food pantry begin to grow food that is becoming part of what is handed out at the food pantry. And what I've seen through that is it really connects images of the organic nature of ministry, of discipleship, with the work that we're doing with people's lives. And so you just realize it becomes much more relational, much more dignifying. It speaks of new creation into people's lives. And so, right here on our campus, which is on the north side of the city, that garden, as it plays out in the food pantry, becomes kind of a snapshot of how the work of ministry is beautiful, creative, organic, not controllable, surprising. It doesn't often turn out the way you want it to. And also, I think one of the things I found for myself when I apply some of those things to pastoral ministry sort of chastens my ego, is what phrase I use a lot. Chastens my pride, so that I realize I have control over some things, but I don't have control over a lot of other things. And God is the one, who really does bring fruitful growth, even as we serve and minister.
That word control is, I think, really important to reflect on. I think in each of our individual lives, pastor or not, any of us, and anyone in our neighborhood, control is something that we're told we have. You can watch it in TV commercials or read it online. There's always this sense that if you are feeling like you're not happy in life, just do X, Y, Z, and you can control your happiness. Or if you're not feeling proud of the way your body looks, you can do X, Y, Z, and you can control what your body looks. And of course, there are elements that we do have control over. We have control over what we eat. We have control over, what kind of exercise we do in the day. There's different things we do have control over. But there's, as you said, a lot of things that we don't have control over. And so I wonder, as a pastor, how does the gardening metaphor reframe or reshape the way you are thinking about ministry? Because so often pastors can maybe by default function more like a CEO or like a strategist or something like that, a manager, or as Eugene Peterson said, a shopkeeper,
right?
Rather than a pastor. And there's something unique about a pastor. But there's also, metaphors that pastors use of themselves, like the shepherd. You bring that up in your book. It's a very common one. We think of ourselves as shepherds over a flock. But here you're using the gardener. And how has that reshaped the way you really see the role of the pastor and the things you do have control over?
Let me tell a story. I was with a friend who's a pastor in Jordan in the Middle East once, and we were traveling down from Mount Nebo area to the Jordan River Valley. And as we were traveling down this very rocky, barren terrain, there was a young boy who was a shepherd, and he had sheep all around him. And I said to my friend Yusuf, wow, this is this guy going to be okay out here? There's no water around. It's utterly desert. It's rocky. And he told me two things that were helpful for me, because I'm just picturing this kid out here on his own, doing his own thing. He said, first, he's heading down to the river valley where it's going to be lush. We're going to drive down there. We will see that soon enough. He'll find what he's looking for. And the second thing he said is he's not out here by himself. He is part of a community that he's going to come together with when they reach the valley and the lush area around the Jordan River, where they could be able to water their flocks and those sorts of things. And I realized something in that process. The reason I'm telling this story is it helped me realize that something was happening in my imagination when I thought of the shepherd that wasn't very helpful for me. I think that the shepherding imagery is so important in Scripture, so important when we think about pastoral ministry. The sheep hear the shepherd's voice. There's so much about that that's so vital for being a pastor, and it's what the word means, right? But what I found creeping into my imagination as a Western pastor, highly individualistic culture that we live in, is that there were certain things creeping into my imagination through that image that weren't helpful to me. One, it was very much the idea of the pastor trying to make something happen out there by themselves, disconnected from community, just with their flock. And out of that then came some of these other images that are prevalent in the culture. The CEO, the person who's going to make these things happen. And I was really struggling, around the time of the pandemic and some other things like that with what is the church and what is pastoral ministry. And when I read in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, where Paul says, I planted and Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, that became a very powerful, again, doorway into rethinking ministry. Yes, I do have control. I can plant, I can water, I can nourish, I can till the soil, I can make sure things are getting good sunlight, but I'm not the one who makes things happen. That's going to be God. And so it helped me let go of maybe subtle ways the CEO mindset had crept in, or just being a strategist had crept into my way of thinking about pastoral ministry, and enabled me to think more in terms of things like the soil of ministry, the environment in which we're doing things, practices that have been upheld over the long haul for pastors, of being part of a community. And all of that for me became very connected with agrarian imagery in Scripture, and just did something to my imagination, which was so life-giving and freeing for me. So landing on this image of the pastor as a gardener, or the pastor as a farmer, really set me free in so many different ways.
Can you say a bit more about the soil? What do you mean
Yeah.
by that? Like the soil of ministry. You mentioned that a lot in the book. What
Yeah.
is that? Are there different layers of that soil? Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Travis. Like there are so many layers to that. I talk about soil in terms of the congregation that we're serving in. You're in Palo Alto. I'm in Milwaukee. We talked about this even before our conversation started here. That the different type of soil of our congregations, it's unique. As pastors, we have to pay attention to that specific place. Wendell talks about the uniqueness of geography for farming, and I think that applies so well to pastoral ministry. We need to think about the geography of the place, what shapes it, what shapes people's lives, what's the history of our congregation. That's part of the soil. My church is a non-denominational church, so even the ecclesial background, the denominational background, shapes how we do pastoral ministry in these places. I think that's part of the soil. And then also, the North American context, what's happening in the Church of North America is part of our soil for us here in North America. And the same would be true for people in other places. What are the currents that are part of church life in North America? Those are all things that I think do become part of the elements of the soil in which we are here. And so being attentive to the place in terms of city and geography, being attentive to the place in terms of history, being attentive to the place in terms of ecclesial background, and then that broader culture. Here in Milwaukee, there's a wonderful thing I'll tell people to do often if they're new to our city and they're coming to be part of our staff or planting a church in the area. There's a PBS special called The Making of Milwaukee that I will tell people, hey, watch this and you will get a better sense of the lay of this history of this place. And I think it's important to know we can't just take some model from some place and just put it into our church or our area. We need to be attentive to the soil of the place. It's unique. It's different. Just like the soil in Atlanta is more red than the soil of the place where I grew up in the Mississippi River Valley, more brown soil. It's just different. And it's important to pay attention to that and not be blind to that as pastors.
Yeah. I think that's so helpful, the image of the soil and trying to really get to know your soil. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there's also the risk that of soil erosion, which
Mm-hmm.
might be another way of thinking about it too. Um, this last year, my my daughter, she was learning about soil erosion, and so she was playing out in the yard, using the hose and playing in the dirt and talking about what happens when the water hits all the dirt and where it goes. And I wonder, when pastors don't understand or don't have a healthy framework for how they're viewing ministry, is what are the risks of soil erosion within
Mm-hmm.
a place or a congregation? How have you experienced or seen that?
This is such a great question. This is part of why I've had so much fun with this book, Travis, is you can play with
Hmm.
these concepts in our imaginations. And what you're suggesting right now is honestly something I've thought a little bit about, but let me try to let's think about it out loud together a little
Yeah.
bit. Again, Wendell Berry, one of my heroes, he talks a lot about soil erosion in his writing and the way that it just strips away the nutrients of farmland, and even that certain contemporary farming methods contribute to soil erosion.
Hmm.
And I think that part of when I think about that in relation to pastoral ministry is if we are only thinking about quick fixes or quick routes to fruitfulness, we will often put things in, pull things out very quickly in our churches. Maybe it's a form of ministry, maybe it's a new activity, maybe it's something that's been vital to the life of the church for a really long time. And we can come in as a new pastor and say, I don't know what this is about. Let's get rid of that. And when we do that, it takes out some of the rootedness, I think, of the community. Sometimes we may not realize something that doesn't seem central actually might be underneath the ground, kind of part of what secretly holds things in its place. And then when we do that, we will lose sometimes the nutrients of what that was bringing. Sometimes there's unintended consequences. We'll lose people. I understand that will happen in our ministries, but I think quickness, hurry, is sort of the enemy of fruitfulness and long rootedness of what helps keep the soil in place. I'd love to hear what you think about it. It's a really great question.
Yeah, I mean, I immediately think of the Dust Bowl in the
Yeah.
1930s, like, dust flying everywhere because everyone thought if we just plant and plant and you know harvest and harvest and harvest, we we'll get rich. And the goal became not about caring for the earth, but it became about really mm, striking rich.
Yeah.
And just the devastation that came during the Dust Bowl, with people having to flee their homes and lose their life while they were fleeing, and then end up in basically almost slave-like conditions in California. And I mean, obviously, there's just so many stories of the devastation of the Dust Bowl. Um, but it also, one thing that comes to my mind is that some of the stories of the Dust Bowl is they tell stories of um, people cleaning their homes
Hmm.
because the dust was just coming in. And so they'd spend like the whole day cleaning their homes, but then immediately the dust would be back. And it was like
Mm.
this endless task of cleaning. And I think like in a church, in a congregation, if you, like you said, go too fast, if you're trying to force things that don't really fit the soil, then you end up having to spend a lot of time cleaning up, and
Hmm.
you could make that decision quick and then have years of consequences of cleaning something up that's just like you're trying and trying, but you're not able to get it cleaned up. So that's the kind of one of the images that come to my mind.
Hmm.
um,
I love
and
that. It's yeah, it makes me think so much about that. And even how you mentioned people were just trying to get rich.
mhm,
Um, most pastors I know are not trying to get rich out of
Yes.
ministry, but I think sometimes we can have different types of riches that we might look to, where we're trying to extract something from a congregation. Sometimes we're trying to get a sense of identity. Sometimes we're trying to get people's like of us to help us feel okay about ourselves. Sometimes we are trying to get famous, through our church or through our ministry. And I think if we as pastors are extracting things, that also kind of resonates with what you're talking about soil erosion, coming in with the wrong purposes in mind. Instead of serving that congregation like a good farmer or gardener serves the land in one sense, even as they are farming.
Yeah, so let's talk about what it means to serve the land and contribute to the growth of the soil, to the health of the soil. What are some practices? I think I like thinking about practices in particular, both as a pastor, like as an individual pastor, like what practices help nurture the soil of your own soul, but then also like how does that leading a congregation and helping that soil grow as be healthy as well? Because I loved there's a line in your book, and I won't quote it exactly, but it's something like fruitful ministry flows out of a pastor's own relationship with God.
Yeah.
Something like that. Like it's like the sense of like it's not about how much expertise a pastor has. It's about the richness of their relationship with God, and that's where ministry comes from. That's where it flows from. Um, so yeah, just tell us a little bit about that. How do we do that?
Yeah, that's one of my I don't have slogans too often with my staff team here at Eastbrook, but it's one of the things I think almost everybody on my staff could probably say, that line is that fruitful ministry arises from the overflow of our own life with God. I just have that as such a deep commitment. And I think that could be misunderstood. I'm not saying that we don't learn and grow, for a preacher, that we don't learn how to preach better or things like that. But I think in our day and time, we have really cultivated expertise, sometimes just in skills, or at worst, kind of maybe the techniques of ministry. And I like to use the image of a plant growing in soil, and say that the external and visible works of ministry that we might put around kind of three categories: ministry of the word, ministry of prayer, ministry of discipleship, or sometimes people might say church discipline. I use that in an expansive way related to spiritual formation. Those are the things that people will see, those visible works of preaching or teaching a Sunday school class or exhorting a small group or something, our life of prayer in a Sunday service, the prayers we give with people when we visit in the hospital, those one-to-one conversations of discipleship, whether it is premarital counseling or some group that we're leading, a men's or women's group. Those things are really important, but those are the things that we see above the ground, a plant's, visible life. Underneath the ground for pastors, I believe, are those sort of hidden works or practices that have to be there to send our roots down deep. And those mirror those things. So I think our own life with the word, not just preparing a sermon or a teaching, but are we imbibing scripture? I know this is so basic in some ways, but even though it's so basic, I know a lot of pastors who it's not really part of our practice other than preparing for ministry, where we're really letting a meditative reading of scripture bring life to us, feed our souls. Our own life of prayer, not just asking God as we're driving to a hospital visit, give me the words, but that's valid. But like developing our life of listening and loving attention to God and letting Him speak into our lives, letting Him slow us down in stillness. And then even the discipline that comes to us from God, our formation, letting our lives be formed. All of these I view are things that are underneath the soil, and nobody else has to see them necessarily. But we have to be giving ourselves to what Peterson and others call this ascesis, this discipline of shaping our lives with God. There is a part of discipline to that, but it's also where the life is. And those are the roots underneath the soil. So I think there's some attention to practices like that for our nurture and formation as pastors that I think I just hear a lot of conversation about the above ground visible work. I want to call us back to kind of just as much attention about that hidden under the ground work. At least that's part of where I would start with the pastor's own life, Travis. And with relation to the church, there are other places I can go, but I'll pause here for a little bit before I leap into that.
I think that's so helpful. I think what I imagine most people, the average person assumes the stuff hidden, the prayer, the soaking in the word, they just assume for a pastor that obviously they must be doing that.
Right.
I'm still like, I get surprised when someone I'm ministering to makes some comment about how they think of me because I'm a pastor as someone like holier or something like that, which I'm still like, because in my mind, that's not at all how I think of myself. Like I don't think of myself like that. But pastors can't really. It's hard to escape this feeling that pastors are put on a pedestal, maybe a very short pedestal, maybe a tall pedestal. Who knows? But there's this sense there, and I think what you're getting at is really important because if everyone assumes you're doing something, it's easy to not do it.
Yeah.
Because there's just an inherent lack of accountability there.
Yeah. Or to just assume I must be doing that because people think I'm doing that. It almost kind of becomes a negative self-fulfilling prophecy for us sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that's really important for pastors to consider. One thing I might say for pastors listening, is, we are really busy with the work God has given us to do in our churches. And preparing a Sunday sermon is no joke. And it takes time, and you've got to sit with the word. And so one of the practices I've just recently taken up that's helped me, and I'll share it, is the Ignatian exercise of imaginative reading.
So
have you heard of this before?
Yeah.
And it basically, to just summarize it, is this way of reading is that you read the text a few times to become familiar, and then you begin to ask yourself questions about what's going on in the text, not like exegetically, but more like physically, like what do you see, what do you feel, what do you hear in this passage? So I think of the story of Jesus in the boat with his disciples, and the storm has started. So you can feel the water on your feet. You can feel the rain coming down. You're cold. You're seeing the look on everyone else's face. They're terrified, and you start to put yourself in that place. And then you really immerse yourself in the story, and you ask yourself, what is God teaching me through this story? How do I see myself? And then after you've done this, and you can look it up online, there's clear guides for how to do it. But that's the kind of the simple way. And then you come out of it, and then you just spend some time reflecting on it. And for me personally, doing that as a beginning step in my sermon prep, really, and again, I'm a real beginner at this, but like it's really helping me, I guess, get out of my head to start the sermon. And really commune, because it requires a lot of reflection. And so I just offer that to pastors as one way of, because I think, and, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. I feel like in seminary or in pastoral training, or just in the culture of pastoral ministry, it's easy to like read old pastors like Charles Spurgeon or Jonathan Edwards or whoever, whoever it may be. And we hear these stories about these guys who were like, and they got up at 2 a.m. to pray, and they prayed
Yeah.
for 4 hours, and the world was shaking because of their, it's like that
Yeah.
kind of
Right.
image. And it's
Uh-huh.
just for the average person, which most pastors are just average people, that's
Yep.
so like, it's just like out of reach.
Yes.
You're like, I got to be up with my kid at 6 to get them out the door. Like, how does this work? Um, so I think like thinking about like in our day to day, how do we change some of our work so that it becomes more attuned to our
Yeah.
relationship with God? Um, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I love that beautiful invitation for people to enter into the Ignatian practice of that imaginative reading, Travis, because I do think it helps us to activate other parts of our lives than our brains, which
Hmm.
a lot of pastors were really good at activating our brains for study of Scripture, and we should.
Hmm.
I'm in favor of using the best of our minds, but sometimes our imagination and our hearts can be a little bit deflated in that
Mm.
process. So being able to enter in other ways, I think, is really, really, really helpful. And just to echo what you're saying, I have sort of two things that may sound like I'm saying opposites, and I don't want it to sound that way. On the one hand, I resonate so much with what you said about all those old stories we read about Luther or Calvin or whoever, getting up, at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. and praying for the first 3 hours of their day, and just feeling like that's just impossible for me. And so I want to just extend grace to anybody who's listening, whether you're a pastor or not. When
Mhm.
we find those moments where we just feel like that's impossible, I just want to speak grace. Just let that go. Let go of the shame,
Mm.
and and then hear the invitation of God to the deeper life at the same time. And when I say deeper life, I don't mean, stepping outside of our everyday life, but enter into the invitation of God right where you are, right what you're doing, um, right in the midst of your activities, sort of like you're saying, in that
Mhm.
ordinary place, to enter into deeper conversation with God, to pray through the day, to hear the invitation to find rest, to encounter holiness of God in some more profound ways. And so it's both like grace and then hear that invitation. And I had an old mentor who used to say something to me. He would say, you can't lead somebody a place you haven't gone.
Mhm.
And I do think there is a calling. I'm real careful about trying to say this. There's a calling that's also an invitation to pastors to go deeper with God and to lead people in there. We might just be a step ahead. We might be right with them. But I definitely think there's a sense that today people are looking for sages. And um, I'm not saying I'm a sage. I definitely don't think that. I'm just saying I think there's an invitation for pastors to be those kind of people in the world, who walk with God and invite people into that in a rich way.
Sage is a great word. Um, yeah, sage is a really important word, I think, for ministers. Something I think we should be aspiring to,
Mm,
and the kind of people we should surround ourselves with.
yes.
Like who are the sages in our lives that we can
Hmm.
honestly be like, those are the kind of people they got what I want. Like I'm and it's funny you bring that word up because last week I had these two meetings with what I would call who I would describe as both of them were sages. And it was the first time I had spent time with either of them. Just kind
Mm,
of so happened last week. Both were these 2 hour, just long conversations. Um, and they were just there for me in a way that I really needed. But I
mm,
came away from both conversations feeling like, wow, they they have encountered something with God that I also want. Like
mhm,
whatever it is, I want that.
mhm.
And when you don't see that, like when you don't encounter people like that, I don't think it's like you don't always realize it's available. Um, but there are real sages in the world,
Hmm.
more than we think, probably. Um, so that is
Yeah.
just so helpful. And
Yeah.
I think that leads into a bit, you talk about hope as the pastor's primary virtue. I mean, obviously, there's lots of virtues that we all need, but hope is kind of a defining virtue for the pastor as gardener.
Hmm.
Um, and I would imagine that sages are people of deep hope. Um, when you meet someone who has lost hope, they're not, they don't inspire you.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because, if you've lost hope, you've, that often quickly leads to just giving up on so much in life.
Hmm.
But deeply hopeful people are are also people who persevere, people who um, admit are truthful about the most difficult realities of life, and yet remain hopeful. So,
Mm.
do you mind just talking a little bit about why you chose hope as the defining virtue, and yeah, just share a
Yeah.
bit about that with us.
Well, we think of, those three that remain, right? Faith, hope, and love. And Paul says the greatest of these is love. I'm not going to argue with the apostle about the primacy of love over all things, but part of what I'm trying to say about hope is that in a time where the church is in decline across North America,
Mm,
where there are so many questions about the validity of not just the church or the Christian message, although that is there, right? Also, the validity and trust in pastors, that we really have to take a long term perspective on pastoral ministry if we're going to be in it, not just for the long haul for ourselves, but we have to
mm,
take kind of a generational perspective. And so the image that comes to my mind when I think about gardening or farming or even work with trees, sometimes I think of that passage that says that there'll be oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord. If we want to see that sort of thing happen, if we want to see the church and Christians thriving in that kind of way, then we're going to have to take a long term, hope filled perspective. Any gardener who plants something is planting with hope. If you set
mm,
a seed in the soil, which my wife and I did just the last few weeks as we're trying to get ready for spring. This morning, she asked me as I was checking something else outside. She said, "Go look at the raised beds and see if you see anything." That's like hope. Something I'm
mm,
looking for something. I'm watching for something, and I think pastors have to have that hope-filled sense with God that God is doing something, and I'm watching for it. I'm attentive to it. And also, in spite of ourselves, sometimes God is also doing a hope filled work within us. He's shaping us, He is working through us in our foibles and our flaws and bringing something there. And even though we may not be able to see it, we're still going to work the soil. We're still going to do the faithful work that He's called us to in our churches. Within the whole setting of our world today, we need people who are going to continue to be faithful so that fruitfulness can spring up by God's grace. And hope is essential to that. Hope is not just something that we work up ourselves like optimism. I really believe hope for us as Christians, it is linked with that resurrection reality of Jesus and also with the eschatological future that's in front of us. There is going to be a new heaven and new earth. And so we live that out now in hope, even if it seems counterintuitive, even if it can feel sometimes like things are coming apart. I just think there's so much hope for us based in the gospel, based in what God is doing, and that enables us to take next steps and look to the future, even generations beyond us.
The phrase that comes to my mind as you're talking is heavenly citizenship,
Yes.
in the sense of um, the new heavens and the new earth, that our citizenship is locked in place there. And that because it's locked in place, because Jesus is there and he's claimed it as our own, we have this steadfast hope. And I mean, that I just feel like it can be applied in so many ways. I mean, the church is declining, you know, and yet our hope remains the same. The um, the country feels like it's in chaos.
Yeah.
The world feels like it's in chaos.
Mm-hmm.
The stock markets are just going nuts. Like, you can just name so many things. People are feeling disconnected and lonely more than ever. But when we come back to this hope you're talking about, that it's solid, it's immovable because it's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very powerful aspect of the gospel, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we don't give it enough time. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, bringing it to the forefront is really helpful.
Mm.
So as we close, we just have a couple minutes left. Why don't we just finish by talking about Jesus, our hope?
Yeah.
When you look at the life of Jesus, his ministry, in light of this metaphor of the gardener, what stands out to you? And what would you want to send our listeners home with, thinking about who Jesus is?
Well, the first place I leap to in the Gospels when I think about this kind of image is always John 15, Jesus being the vine and we are the branches. And it says there in John 15 that God, the Father, is the gardener. And so I think that's a really important image for us to remember. Our vitality comes as branches in the vine of Jesus with his life flowing into us, and that God, the gardener, is giving care to our lives and through us into the work where we are, if we're pastors or wherever we're working in our lives. But the other place that I think sometimes gets kind of overlooked is at the end of the Gospel of John, when Jesus appears after the resurrection. Mary is in the garden, she's weeping, and it says that she sees him and mistakes him for the gardener. And I just believe John is such a careful writer. This is no mistake. It's not a passing mention. I think John is connecting in that moment in similar ways that we know he does in John chapter 1 with Genesis. And he's telling us that there's a new creation, a new gardening work happening, just like that creation work that was happening in Genesis 1. Now Jesus is bringing something in new. He is the gardener, and he's inviting us to be gardeners with him in the world, in people's lives, certainly, as we do ministry or we share the gospel with people, but also in the created world, to be emissaries of good news and to be for blessing of the cities in which we live, the places that God has planted us until that new heaven and new earth comes in. So to remember that Jesus is the vine and we're branches in him, but also that he's the gardener and he is assembling a veritable army of gardeners for his purposes in the world, for the blessing and goodness of the world. I think to have that in our minds about Jesus is just so profound.
Mm-hmm. An army of gardeners. That is a great phrase. That disempower, or that pulls out violence out of the army, right? And empowers them as peacemakers. And that's beautiful. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to finish. Matthew, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Travis. It's an honor to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the Faith Informing Podcast. If this episode encouraged you, share it with a friend and consider leaving a review. Until next time, make space, stay curious, and keep being formed by the faith you confess.